Recorded live from the Maddie Johnson podcast studio at GOT Sound Studio in Columbia, South Carolina. This is the All About Nothing podcast. The views expressed on this program are the opinions of the host. Some content and subject matter may not be appropriate. Listener discretion is advised. Listeners are encouraged to follow the show at theallaboutnothing.com for links to social media and more. Listeners can call the show at 803-672-0533. Thank you for listening.
All right, welcome to the All About Nothing podcast. I am Barrett Gruber, and this week my guest is Lisa Ellis. She is the Democratic nominee for South Carolina Superintendent of Education. Welcome, Lisa, to the show. Thank you for being here.
Oh, it's such a pleasure, Barrett. Thank you so much for having me today.
Yeah, I'm sorry we couldn't have Zach and Trent in here with us. We all have children that once you're elected, that will have you will have an effect on their education. So it's a shame they can't be here, but you know, being a Tuesday we're recording this, we generally record on Wednesdays, and it's hard to get them in there on those days, on Wednesdays too. So so I'm glad you could be here with us.
Well, I appreciate the flexibility.
Yeah, absolutely. So Lisa, you are running for Superintendent of Education, and we talked about it real briefly before we started recording. Nowhere on your website does it say anything about being a Democrat. There's got to be a reason for that?
Well, I think that this position should be nonpartisan. I really think that, you know, education affects everybody, whether or not you have children directly in school. You know, people have grandchildren, they have neighbors that have children in school, but ultimately we as a state are impacted by the success of public education. And so it shouldn't be a Democratic slant. It shouldn't be a Republican slant. It shouldn't be any sort of third party slant. We all should care about public education. And to me, that transcends, political parties. And one of the things that we push is that, you know, you've got to take care of people over party. You know, you've got to focus on policy over party, and that's what we felt should be the focus, is my educational experience, my why for wanting to do this, and not necessarily my connection to a particular party or not.
Agreed. No, and
that would be the least of the qualifications, is what party I'm affiliated with.
Agreed. And qualifications do sort of come into something like this.
This year, absolutely. Yeah.
It should be noted that Ellen Weaver is still seeking her master's, which is actually it's on the books as being one of the requirements is to have a master's. You have two of them. So a master's in arts and organizational leadership from Columbia College, as well as a master of science in forest resource management from Clemson. Those are legitimately, those are not easy courses. So congratulations on that. I know it was a little while ago, but Ellen Weaver.
Well, it was, and you know, I loved both programs. I can't begin to share how much I learned through it, not just about the content, but about me as a human and me as a student, which has then transcended into the classroom, and I hope will transcend into the role of Superintendent of Education. You know, there's a lot to be said about going and getting a higher education degree, not so much in terms of the content, but what it teaches you as a person. And you know, both of my masters were difficult and time consuming.
Yeah, absolutely. I look at a lot of the teachers that I know, they all have masters as well. Now you've been in education, I guess since early 2000s, 2003, 2004.
Yeah, I just started my 22nd year.
Goodness.
So I started at a high school, at Ridgeview High School. It's actually a long-term sub. In October, a teacher went out on maternity leave, and then they hired me full-time that January because an English position came open. And so I was able to start mid-year, which is only great in the sense that if I make it to retirement, that I'm eligible to retire mid-year.
Wow.
That.
What is the requirement for retirement in South Carolina?
Well, it depends. If you became a teacher prior to 2012, to receive your full retirement benefits, you've got to work to year 28, which is a random number. I don't know where 28 came from. My goal is to make it to 30 because that's a nice even number, 30 years. However, if you started teaching after the year 2012, it's the rule of 90. So your years of service and you add your years of service to your age, and that has to equal 90 to when you can retire, which I think has led to just, we're not even there yet, but I think has been an indirect negative impact on our younger teachers, like losing our younger teachers quickly, because that's so far down, the path of the future that they're like, oh, well, I mean, I'll never make it that long or something like that.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. That is that's an odd mathematical equation that they came up with to come up with retirement for benefits, and that's now I feel bad for a lot of them because they started when they were like 21. So right. 20, 22, right. 23, that is an exceptionally long time to be working. But and I have to also acknowledge the fact that teaching is not easy. My wife has a bachelor's in early childhood education. But we homeschool our children. And one of the reasons that we homeschool our children is when my son was in middle school, we found that his school was interrupted so often by bomb threats at different schools around the county, around the district, that it got to the point. Well, and then we also had twins. So basically the idea was, well, she has a degree in education, so it kind of makes sense that we would just go ahead and do the homeschooling. But I still am bound and determined to see that education in South Carolina stands up against at least the states next to us. I grew up in Georgia, and I am the product of public school education. And at the time when I went through school, Georgia tended to be a little bit more blue than it is now. So there was a lot of investment being made into public schools with the introduction of the lottery system and things like that. And South Carolina also has the Hope Scholarship with the lottery and that. And so just if you could explain to me when you take office, what is the reign as far as like what is the reach of the superintendent of education? Is it just the public K through 12 school system, or does it involve more than that?
I think and Barrett, that's a great question that I fully don't know all of the ins and outs of it.
So not to stump you then.
No. Well, I mean, I think, when my campaign manager's like, you need to stop saying if and start saying when. So when I make it to office, I think I'm going to learn a lot of things that I was like, oh, I'm responsible for that too, huh? Or no, you're not responsible for that. But it for sure is K through 12 public education. There's also a public charter school district that falls under the Department of Ed. It's not necessarily, it doesn't include higher ed, but I think that there is some sort of maybe sphere of influence in terms of policy that can dictate that. And then of course there's going to be other probably legislation that is not necessarily under education, but impacts students and children in South Carolina that I guess would probably also be like a sphere of influence as well. But it is this, we have, I think 79 school districts, over 800,000 children are in the public school system. So it is a daunting job to have to meet all the various needs of not only the students that come in, but the school districts. We go anywhere from Greenville County that has, I think, 75,000 students, down to Jasper or Hampton that, have a couple thousand tops, and you go from urban to rural. And, that's one of the things that I think has been sort of, we talk about the inequity of education across South Carolina, and I firmly believe that it shouldn't matter what your zip code is. Every student should have access to that high quality education. But that's how we get that is gonna be different depending on the district that you're in.
Right.
And so, I think that we for however long have fought this, tried to teach the 21st century student still using really 19th and 20th century ideals and mechanisms. And so I just really want, when I'm in office, to really start looking innovatively and strategically as to how we can best, address the needs of our students and allowing that to look different. We talk about equality versus equity. And I'm all about the equity. Not every school district should get the same thing because the students that they deal with are going to be different. Not every school should get the same thing. They need to get what they need to allow for that equity rather than equality.
Sure. And it has to be noted, South Carolina several years ago was recognized as having one of the worst school corridors in the country, with the corridor of shame. And that ran basically along that I-95 corridor. I'd like to assume there've been improvements, but it's not something that I've heard much about. Of course, it's dependent on the administration that's in charge. But growing up, South Carolina and Georgia, we were always recognized, even when I was in school, and which we're roughly the same age. But the school systems between Georgia and South Carolina, we were always recognized at being close to the bottom then, because this idea of the standardized tests, and that was how you were judging the value of a school system. When you take office, what is something what is your opinion of standardized testing?
Well, I think that high stakes standardized testing is terrible. I think it does nothing to demonstrate student knowledge or student growth. It is, and really the tests that we give our students tend to be biased, both racially as well as experience biased. And I think, when people talk about the fact that our schools are failing, or our teachers are failing, or our students are failing, I take offense to that.
I would too.
Because I would argue that neither our teachers nor our students are failing. The system is failing our teachers and students. And I think, I think that there is a marked plan to dismantle public education. And if you look sort of past over the last 15 or 20 years and how South Carolina has dealt with, first it was No Child Left Behind, testing kids, and then it was Every Student Succeeds Act to test kids, and the school report card. We decided, and by we, I mean not Lisa Ellis, but the Education Oversight Committee decided that 90% of our school report card at the elementary and middle school level was going to be based on test scores. And so, when you think about, again, the demographics that make up our state, and you talk about 30 to 40% of kids are in poverty, that you've automatically set the bar way too high. And I don't mean that in the sense that our kids can't do it, but when we look at the negative impact of poverty on students, first and foremost, meeting their basic needs, but secondly, meeting the experiences they need to be able to understand the context of a lot of those test questions.
Yeah.
And so, if you've got a student who is, you start testing in third grade, so, 8 or 9 years old, and they've never seen the beach before, or they've never seen a turtle nest, or they've never, done that, and there's a question about the beach, they have no frame of context to really be able to answer that question.
Yeah.
And so, that's where I really feel strongly against high stakes standardized testing. The second piece of that, and, you talked about it earlier, talking about homeschooling and disruptions, because the state report card the criteria is on high stakes testing, districts have added testing to determine where their students are in preparation for that big test. So what you then have is test fatigue because students are being tested. I know our high school sophomores that have to take the end of course English exam. They're tested, not only just tests within the class or assessments within the class, but they're tested 4 times throughout the year, what we call benchmarks. And so by the time you get to the actual test that counts, the kids are tired of it. Like they're worn out. And then the last piece of it is that, the test questions are terrible in the sense that they're boring, they're irrelevant to the students' lives. And so really it's not a matter of what the student knows, but is the student willing to sit through and actually do the test, and sort of that grit piece of sitting down and reading through and doing the best that they can. And so I think that the high stakes testing, the standardized testing, is a terrible way to demonstrate what a student knows and how far they've grown throughout the year. And so, I think that, and with our, the new federal laws, there's a lot of choice in how we assess our students. We don't have to do high stakes testing. We can do student portfolios. We can use, certain tests that measure growth. You test at the beginning of the year, you test at the end. And so, those are things that I think we need to be looking at, because the other piece of it is that, students are learning to pass a test rather than learning for the sake of learning and being excited about learning again. And that's what I think we also, make education miserable for students, because it's all about testing and not about the process of learning, and learning for the sake of learning. And I just feel really strongly about that. The last thing that I'll say, and you're probably regretting asking this question, the last thing I'll say is that the high stakes tests do not measure the skills that we truly need students to have. And those are things like critical thinking, problem solving, those deductive reasoning, all of those skills that employers really are looking for in the job market, because those tests tend to be, either recall, because they're usually set up in multiple choice or memorization. And so, and because we're teaching to a test, teachers don't have the time to dive into those really important skills that will help kids regardless of where they end up in their life. And that's what we really should be doing as public school educators, is preparing students for life beyond our classroom, beyond the school. And I think that the high stakes testing just completely hinders all of that.
Yeah, I would also like to acknowledge that in my 20 years of working as a professional, not in education, but in just in IT jobs and things like that, customer service, whatever, I don't think I was being tested I don't think I was being tested once a year after I'd gotten the job, and they were paying me. We're not paying students.
Right.
What's the incentive to do well on these tests? Well, the incentive is that it makes the school system look better if they do better.
Right.
Right.
So, and the last piece of it, particularly for your 3 through 8th grade tests, those teachers and students don't get the results back until either summer or the next fall.
Right.
And so it doesn't help the teacher in planning, effective instruction, because it's too late. And so when we think about what assessment is for, assessment is really to test, what the student knows, but also the opportunity for the teacher to take that information and say, oh my gosh, my students completely missed decimals, so I need to go back and do that. But when you're not getting scores until 2, 3, 4 months later, you're not able to do that, and that student has moved on, still not knowing decimals, necessarily.
Right. If so, in when you take office, what would be the change that you would like to see enacted under your office? If these standardized tests are not they're not preparing for the children, and they're not preparing the teenagers for life after school, then what changes would you like to see made in order to improve the student's capability. You spoke of critical thinking, and I'd like to throw observance, the ability to observe and recognize and deduce, or basically to be able to come up with solutions based on experiences and things like that. But how is that? In your 20 plus years of educating, you have to have ideas on what potentially would be the best way of educating a student.
Absolutely. And I have to preface this by saying, again, I don't know the specific parameters of what the report card requires, but in an ideal world, you'd really want the student to take ownership of their knowledge and learning. So to me, that looks more like a portfolio of their best work, but more importantly, a reflection on it. And so, that student because when we truly learn, it's a reflection piece, right? Okay, I just did this problem. Now let me reflect on what I liked about it or what I struggled with, and that sort of thing. And so, and you'd have to really take some time. And I think this is where teachers could really be powerful in creating these types of assessments to make them developmentally appropriate, right? Because a reflection of a third grader is going to be very different from an eighth grader from a high school student.
Right.
But I think some sort of portfolio that demonstrates the growth of that student, because the other piece of it is, our students come to us at all different levels. And so to expect them to take the same test, again, is insanity. And so, and so creating, again, some sort of best practice document not only helps demonstrate the growth, but shows that student and gives that student the confidence of, oh my gosh, look at how much I improved over this year.
Yeah.
And that's something that, the teachers or a group of people could grade based on a rubric, what we call, and determine it that way. I also think what I would really like to see, particularly at the high school level, is incorporating some sort of internship, period, or some sort of, our school has work-based learning where a student can get a credit for having an after-school job. And so, and the employer keep track of the hours that they worked, and the employer has to fill out, a progress monitoring is what we call it in school, every so often. But I think, like, if we really want, if businesses, what they keep telling schools is, we can teach them the knowledge of the job. We just need to have them coming to us with these skills. And so I think opening up and giving students opportunities to dive into internships and have that count as part of their success. Again, that portfolio looks differently, but that, their best work, that reflection piece, and then maybe some outside world, opportunities. Maybe for elementary and middle school, we put in some sort of community service opportunity, for them, where they can get community service and learn about giving to others. And again, all of that builds into that how to be a decent human being.
Yeah.
We really should be teaching in schools, along with the content. You and I grew up in a time where if we had to do I assume that you mentioned that we're similar in age.
Yeah.
If we had to do research, we had to go to the library. You had to physically walk to the school library or get your mom and dad to drive you to the public library. You had to look up, we joke about how you started the research project with World Book Encyclopedia because it was easy. Then you looked at the Britannica because it gave you a little bit more detail. And then if there were books, and then if you really were screwed and had to look at newspapers, you had to look at the microfiche, right? Yeah. That was a thing.
Oh, yeah.
And, and so we really didn't have access to it. Kids are walking around now with the entire world on their phones.
Oh,
so we don't necessarily need to be teaching them content anymore because they can very quickly access it. What we've got to be teaching them is what to do with the content. Do they believe the content? Is it valid? Is it reliable? Is it true? And yet we're still working in that system of, oh, well, we've got to go to the library to get the World Book to get the information.
Right.
And so, I think that along with that, and that's how you can really change, your testing. I think even if you still had to do some sort of high stakes 1-day testing, instead of it being multiple choice, you'd have open-ended questions, and they could demonstrate their knowledge without, and saying, this is what I think, and this is why I think it.
Yeah.
The problem is that it honestly takes a much longer time to grade, but that's how they score AP exams. So
right.
It's not like we can't do it. I just think there's lots of different ways to assess students' learning and make it real world. I mean, I think, how many times I reflect on my own work in my job and think, well, that lesson went terribly. What do I need to do to make it better?
Sure.
And, we've got to build in those real world skills. And I think you can do it through assessment. And then automatically, if you're looking at authentic assessment, South Carolina, I would bet would not be as low in the stakes, the
rankings.
Yeah. We are, because you're now actually looking at, student performance that is fair and reliable.
Right. Yeah, you were talking about having to go to the library to actually pull the data in order to write a paper or things like that. I was lucky enough. We had, I don't know how many volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and it seemed like somehow one of my parents was being talked into buying it almost every year.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
that is a commitment to your education.
Yeah, well, I'm not saying
they were not cheap.
No, that's what I was saying. I was going to say I'm not entirely certain that it didn't put us so far in debt. No, but we had decades of National Geographic, and but these were all reference material that throughout the course of my K through 12. That this was these were normal, and you're right. Now kids walk around with phones, but I think one of the most concerning thing is the children and teenagers having to decipher what's real and what isn't real. That to me is I can't believe that I have friends and neighbors that have a hard time deciphering the news, whether to believe what they're hearing on the news or not. That's
absolutely. I'm in a different position the last 2 years at Blackwood doing student activities, which I love. But prior to that, I taught journalism and media production for 3 years. And we spent the first 9 weeks of the school year going through media bias, like how to learn to trust sources, because that was has become such a big thing to understand, is that, you can't, like, if you listen to this side, you also need to listen to this side to make sure that you're understanding, the perspectives. But to me, it was so important to make sure kids understood that you can't always believe everything you read, you can very rarely believe everything you see on social media, which is where most of them get their information nowadays.
Yeah.
And I'm not a big social media person. I struggle with it. But to me, Twitter is, and I hope I don't get sued by Twitter. I hope I'm too small potato to worry about that. But, to have to sit there and narrow these big, complex world issues down to what I think is 280 characters now. It used to be 140.
Right.
Just really does a disservice, because that's really all that people read. And there's no way you can sit there and talk about climate change in 280 characters.
Yeah.
And so it just really, and for me, that's one of the things I love about teaching high school, is because I get to have these conversations with students and, really sit there and talk to them about issues and, perspectives and stuff like that. And it's so, there's a lot of aha moments that you see, particularly, well, at any age, but really in terms of with high school students. And it's just a great great opportunity to share those. Why do you believe that? And just ask those questions. Well, I
Yeah.
saw, and I joke with my mother because she's 82 and she's like, well, I read on Facebook, and I was like, Facebook, Mom, Facebook.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like I have I want to say very close relationships that are feeding some of the incorrect information. Not that it's incorrect, just overly exaggerated. I won't say that it's incorrect. So what is it like campaigning and working full time as a teacher? I cannot imagine that there is much free time to sit down on your couch and be interviewed by Barrett on the All About Nothing podcast. This is really a treat for us because with everyone that we've interviewed so far throughout this process, throughout this campaign year, most of them are campaigning very small areas. Yours is statewide. That's a big deal. What is that like?
It is, and I have. I have an amazing campaign team. I mean,
Yeah.
and that set up about 2 weeks before the primary, and just really prior to that, a couple friends who were also teachers and I were trying to do it on our own. And of course, none of us had ever run for office before, and we didn't know what we were doing. And so the campaign team has come in and just really been awesome. But it was really a conversation about, wait, what do you mean you're not taking a leave of absence from work? And I was like, that's not even an option. Like, I have bills to pay.
Yeah.
How do people, and so that has been really, I think, tough for them to navigate and tough for people to understand.
Yeah.
Because it is not, teaching is its own beast where you really have to be tuned in to what's going on in front of you at all moments of the day. I mean, you're directly responsible for the well-being of students, regardless of, what age they are. And so, I tell, I say my hours are 8 to 4:15. I have yet to make it home, at that time because it's the start of school year and it's so crazy.
Yeah.
But I cannot answer anything, at that time. And so I think it has been difficult, particularly for the press to understand that I'm unavailable, for, luncheon groups that want me to come and speak at lunchtime and I'm unavailable, those sort of things. And honestly, I think it speaks to one of the problems in South Carolina is that we don't necessarily have the best people running for office because they can't afford to, or, their job doesn't allow them the freedom and flexibility to do that.
Yeah.
And, I don't know how you fix that, but I'll be honest with you though, I have really enjoyed, being at school because it allows my mind to turn off the campaign and the politics and the stuff like that, because at the end of the day, it is politics. I am not a politician. I'm just not. Like, I think that people, my honesty or my transparency, either people love it or they're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe she said that out loud, because it's, it's those sort of things. And I guess your typical politicians try to hedge on either side. But it is nice to go. And it's also really been good for me to be around my students to remind me of why I'm doing this. I had no plans to run for superintendent of education. I actually spent 2 years trying to get other people to run for the office, and they all said no. So it was a very last minute decision for me to do it. And I joke that I joke with my principal that when I am elected, that I'm going to have to keep a key to the school because I'm going to need to sneak in and just be around students.
Yeah.
Just to get their energy and insight and all of that, because I just, adults are tough to work with. And that's what I realized what I'm going to be doing a lot of.
You would be surprised so we did a podcast interview with someone else that has their own podcast. And that was one of the questions that they asked was, what was one of the things about becoming an adult that you had to get used to. And I said, honestly, dealing with other adults. I said, because there's a precedent when it comes to teenagers and children and things like that. There's a there's a level of inequality when it comes to my vocabulary versus theirs, or but like I that was honestly COVID was one of those situations, at least I benefited from, that it gave me the opportunity to while I still work with people, I don't have to work directly with them or within view of them, that sort of thing. So, but yeah, I completely understand. And I think that the idea of a superintendent of education for a state still, putting them, at least recognizing that the level that you're basically in office to support is the students, and the idea of going and even if you're doing it incognito, it's you're observe, you would have the ability to observe. And I know it sounds like a joke, but I fully support you doing it. Just security wise, it's good. Yeah,
I'll absolutely have to do it. Otherwise, I'll lose my mind. We talk about. People are like, how can you work with teenagers and all that? And I love teenagers, but children, you get frustrated with them,
sure.
But you realize that they're learning, right? I mean, if we talk about the fact that you don't have a fully formed brain until you're 25 and you understand the development stages of children, like when they make a mistake, it's because they're learning. And so it's so much easier to forgive children in that aspect. Adults, I just think you should know better. You're an adult. You should know better.
Yeah.
And you should stop acting, however way you're acting. And so I will definitely have to be sneaking back in. And I think also, that's one of the things that I think that, when you start moving, when you're still in education, but you start moving out of direct contact with students. So you move up to a district office, or you move to the State Department of Ed, or you move to the General Assembly, or wherever you go, you forget, right? You forget what it's like. And, we talked, I always said, if you haven't taught, it used to be, if you haven't taught since cell phones were a thing, like you don't know what it's like to be a teacher. Then it became, if you haven't taught since smartphones were a thing, you don't know what it's like to be a teacher. And then it was, if you haven't taught since streaming media and Disney Plus was a thing, you don't know what it's like. And then the latest one is, if you haven't taught through COVID, you have no idea what it's like to be in the classroom teaching. And I think, when you get the further away, but yet you're still making policy, you forget what it's like. And so to me, part of part of making policy is reminding yourselves of who that policy is intended for. And so we talk about, when we're making third grade state education standards, those people that are on that committee need to be either current third grade teachers, or they need to be going into third grade classrooms to remember what that development stage was like. Same thing with high school, because and so that's why, I'm hoping that there'll be schools that are like, hey, here's a key here, come in anytime and just let me sneak in the back door, because I'm going to, I'm going to need to be around students. I love students. I love teaching. I love to be around them, because they're also going to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And, that's what we need. And they know, they want a high quality education, and especially high school students can articulate why they don't necessarily think they're getting it. And we need to bring, definitely need to bring the teacher voice to the table in all this policy, but we also need to bring the student voice.
Yeah.
One of my dear friends, her daughter is fourth or fifth grader, and she told me that when I got elected that she was going to start a petition to get rid of high stakes testing. And I told her, I was like, you don't need to start a petition. And she's like, well, I've got a letter written. And I was like, that's awesome. But she had all these reasons of why we shouldn't be doing these tests. And so when a fourth or fifth grader recognizes that, we need to make some changes.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that there is a lot of value in the opinions of those that are being learned, that they're the students. One of the, not just Ellen Weaver, who you're running against, but being that you are an educator, you have experience in education and being a teacher, having 2 master's degrees, you are also really campaigning against issues that are non-issues. And I think one of the things that I have recognized in South Carolina, having, grown up 25 years ago in school, is this idea that there is a course of education that's being taught that is the idea of is to make people feel bad for things that have occurred in the past, and I'm referring to critical race theory, which ultimately South Carolina does not teach in K through 12, and really it's not really something that's taught as unless you're in university, and then they don't even call it critical race theory. It's U.S. history and world history. But how do you contend, or how do you fight that misinformation? Have you had experience recently in campaigning where someone has come up to you and said, I'm against this critical race theory? Is that something you've had to hear from?
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that, has been a topic because really when I go out and campaign, I'm not somebody who likes to talk about myself at all. And so I usually do a quick introduction and then say, hey, what questions do you have for me? Like, what are you interested in knowing about in terms of education policy or what my stance is? And so usually that's how these things go. And so, almost every place I have been has asked the question, what are your thoughts on CRT? And I always respond with, what is your definition of it? Because that's the other piece of it. When we talk about, you mentioned the fact that these issues that are non-issues, that is one of them. And, I go back to say the number one issue in public education in South Carolina today is the lack of teachers. Full stop.
Yeah.
I mean, you can really even say also the lack of bus drivers and the lack of instructional, but those people who directly interact with students every day, there's a shortage of all of them. And until we solve that problem, nothing else matters, because that's how you get the high quality education to the student. So these issues like CRT or indoctrination or, books that need to be banned, those are all what I call ghosts. We're chasing ghosts. We're changing it so we don't focus on what is actually the problem for 2 reasons. Number one, while the teacher shortage, I think, is simple to fix, it does take funding, and it does take a paradigm shift in what teachers do. And that can be difficult for some people. But the other piece is, again, that narrative to dismantle public education. And how do you do that? Well, you underfund it, which is what South Carolina has successfully done for decades. And then you create this narrative of distrust, right? Oh, we can't trust our teachers. We can't trust our public schools. And that's how you're able to dismantle it, right? So that's exactly what CRT is. That's exactly what, indoctrination is. That's exactly what banning books is, and questioning, how students are getting their information. And we have to be aware of that. What I have learned about the CRT question is everybody has a different definition of what it is. And so when I ask specifically, what do you think it is, then that dictates how I answer.
Sure.
But here's what I will say as a blanket statement about what and how we teach. Students deserve the truth. Mm-hmm. They deserve to understand all of the perspectives. And I'm, specifically talking about history and English at this point. They deserve to understand all of the facets of our history, because I think about, again, my own education, and it was very whitewashed. You always heard history from the victors, right? And so these students now, and that did, like, I've had to do a lot of unlearning in my adulthood. But these students deserve to have all of the perspectives. And then, building in those soft skills in terms of critical thinking and problem solving and understanding the different perspectives and how that impacts the world we live in. The second piece of that is these students deserve to have access to the diverse community that in particularly makes up not only South Carolina, but the United States and even bigger, the world, right?
Yeah,
Again,
agreed.
when we talk about how education has changed, education really in the 20th century and 19th century and going back was a very local experience because people didn't move, right? They grew up in the town that they lived in. They stayed in that town. They got married in that town and died. And we live in a global world, right?
Right.
We have military families that are traveling from all parts of the world that are coming into our schools. We have students that are coming from all different countries. We have students that are coming from different areas of the state, and they're all interacting with each other. And we've got to teach them how great this world, this diverse world is, and also the fact that when you get right down to it, we're not all that different. And that's what makes relationships beautiful. And here's the last thing I'll say about it. These kids don't care.
Right.
They've grown up post-integration. They've, grown up in, a post-world where being different is acceptable and awesome. And I value you for you as a person. You value me as a person. It doesn't matter what, color you are. It doesn't matter what gender you are. It doesn't matter, who you love, but we all respect each other. And so these issues, these ghosts they're adult problems. They're adult problems. And if adults would just get out of the way, and let these future students, be who they are and do all of that, this world would be such a better place. It's not, I walk around, I listen to all the anti-LGBTQ plus rhetoric. I listen to all the race rhetoric, and it's so negative. And I walk into a high school that I work in that is so diverse and see, just the kids interacting with each other and, fist bumping and hugging and hugging appropriately. And it just fills my heart with such hope. And again, I think that's one of the advantages of being able to see the impact of who you're serving. But all of those issues, those are made up adult issues that don't even exist and are not a thing.
They're just talking points. And
Right.
My opinion on all of it, whether it's CRT or banning books, censorship, that sort of thing, my opinion on all of that is basically you're trying to fill the hour of your newscast, and it's you're trying to find things that will scare people. I remember AP US History and AP World History, and I had exceptional teachers that were also coaches. We talked about coaching before, but they were the baseball coaches, and I, even looking back on my education from the 90s, I still in my head I still remember there being a cutoff between as soon as Reconstruction started and World War I. I mean, there was just an immense gap of information. And I have to attribute that partly because I grew up in Atlanta, where the Jim Crow era and post Reconstruction were something that they wanted to forget. And it's not, like you said, it's making sure that students have access to the truth, rather than this idea that they have to we have to indoctrinate them or groom them or limit their experiences. Is just it's frightening to me, because I think that once you start doing that, then that leads to other things where you can fill in those gaps of information with bad information, and then you've created an army. So
no, you're absolutely right. I keep going back to the fact that the kids deserve better, and also the fact that teachers, we as teachers are trained on how to deliver the information and how to build. One of the things that most teachers do at the beginning of the school year is create warm, safe classrooms. Like I don't even really get into content until the third week because I'm too busy, building that class community and building those relationships. So then we can have the tough conversations, right? And so teachers know how to deliver this information and they know how to do it in a safe space so students don't feel marginalized or feel guilt or whatever. Again, all of that is made up and really not even made up by actual parents, but again, the news feed that's coming through whatever they're watching or listening to. And again, it goes back to, one of the reasons that teachers are leaving is the nature of distrust. And teachers are like, it's not worth it. Like, this is not worth it to me to, be attacked at every end for things that are made up, And so I think that's the missing piece is that teachers know and develop how to get this content across in a way that is effective. And we need to change that narrative back of, no, you really can trust your teachers because they do want the best for your children,
Yeah. We have a few more minutes. What is it that you want to make sure that at least my audience knows about your campaign? What is it? What is the driving force behind you becoming a candidate?
The driving force for me to become a candidate was to really make effective change quickly. I joke that my goal is to get elected, serve 4 years, solve all the problems, and go back to the classroom. That's my plan. And I think that, people need to understand that every decision that I make will be in the best interest of the students of South Carolina. And that, that is going to drive every decision, every, influence. All of that is what is in the best interest of students in South Carolina. And that's going to ultimately step on some toes. I mean, we've got some, dug in status quos that need to be either moved out or rethought, and because it's not in the best interest of students. And so, that's really what I'm doing, or what I hope to do. And I keep coming back to, the teacher shortage, because that is solving that issue is in the best interest of students. So that's the driving force behind it, is really focused on what do our students in South Carolina need right now, and also what do they need, when they graduate and go either, into the military or into the workforce or into college. I want them to be prepared for that step and be successful. And so that's the focus of it. I think that people have got to start really paying attention to the person over the party. And I tell people that they also have, if education is important to them, and it should be important to every citizen in South Carolina, again, because we all have to interact with each other.
Right.
And so you're going to ultimately, I tell my students, I'm like, my goal is to get you to a point where you can be successful, because you're going to be taking care of me when I'm in the nursing home. And I need people who are smart and problem solvers and good communicators to take care of me when I'm in the nursing home. And we've got to look at education as that pillar of society, right? It is what helps create a well-functioning society, and we all have a stake in how that's run. And so you really have to stop. You have to be willing to look past party politics and really focus on who's running and why they're running and what their platform is. And instead of just, pulling a straight ticket or sticking to one party or another. And I think also not only in the race for superintendent, but you've also got to look at the other races. The governor race is up, and there are two candidates that feel very differently about public education. Yeah. I tell the teachers that I meet, I'm like, my job would be a whole lot easier if you put pro public education governor in and you put pro public education House members in. right?
Right.
Because that's who's developing a lot of the policy and driving the policy that affects you in the classroom. And then, of course, school boards. And so, we really have got to not only recognize, that our education system is not working as it currently is, and we need to do differently, but we've also got to put into office people who are willing to look at it differently.
One of the things that I have to also acknowledge is that we're almost always right around the corner from the next COVID. I mean, with the way the climate's changing and things like that, we're pushing the line as far as to what's going to wind up, halting education or business and things like that. As far as South Carolina goes, how do you think South Carolina did when it came to education as far as COVID response from the aspect of a teacher perspective?
Yeah, I think that South Carolina as a policy entity didn't do well at all.
Yeah.
I think that teachers and students did the best that they could. We talk about the fact that, the school building closed on Friday, March 3rd, the last day that students and teachers were in session was Friday, March 13th, 2020. And Government Master did the emergency, and so really at our school, we had 2 days before we started seeing students again online. So we had 2 days to really shift everything to these new platforms. And, I get really offended when people say, during COVID when schools closed, because schools didn't close.
Right.
The school building did. But even then, the school building opened back up because schools have become such a, panacea for food, right? We have families, that get breakfast and lunch. And so the school buildings quickly opened up to serve families food. But teachers and students, learning was still happening, right? Now, it looked different than it did when you and I were coming along. And so I think that was hard for people. And I think it, originally it really demonstrated how awesome teachers are.
Yeah.
And then, that narrative had to be changed, right? Because we're trying to dismantle public education. And then it became political. Wearing masks became a political thing. Getting vaccinated became a political thing. Getting students back in schools became a political thing. We as teachers were hesitant about going back to the school building, not because we didn't want to see our students, but because we knew, because of the funding issue, that we couldn't trust that our school districts were going to take care of us and our students.
Right.
And that's where, things got really dicey because of the way the teachers have been treated over the last decade. We, as a system, again, have lost faith that people are taking care of our teachers and students. And, and I talk about the dividers that I was supposed to have in my classroom were made of cardboard and were so short that a high school student sitting at the desk, like their head was over the cardboard, and that, those were created for elementary school students, but it's what was given to us at our high school. And so, that's where we as teachers, we have lost the ability to trust, those decision makers to do what is best for teachers and students. And so, I think that, and then of course you had, again, going back to the equity piece of funding, I work in a district that has a lot of money because we get the local funds because we live in Columbia. But you're talking about your rural area, and so we already have access to computers.
Right.
But you're talking about your rural, that aren't one-to-one, that everybody doesn't have access or didn't have access to Wi-Fi. And so all of those infrastructure pieces that the state has neglected for however many years. We've talked about roads. We haven't, but you talk about the roads in South Carolina. But the lack of internet is now an infrastructure piece. It really brought out the inequities across the state in terms of education.
Right.
Teachers and students did the best that they could with what they were given, And yet they were blamed for all of as COVID dragged on, they were blamed for all of these things that are out of their control, which is what we've seen, which is why the teachers are leaving, because they're like, I can't control a kid in poverty. Like, I have no control over that, or I can't have which they do because they can vote, right? Vote people in, they're going to do it. But, I'm being blamed for things that are out of my control. And again, it's not worth my own happiness in life to continue to put up with that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think, South Carolina has such potential to support, because there's so much room to grow that South Carolina could be the pilot program for just a widespread, internet service free to students. There's so much potential here in South Carolina, and I really, this is where I live. I've been here for more than 20 years, and I want to see it do well. And I think part of that is having leadership that has experience in the necessary functions in order to provide the best perspective on how to make change positive.
Absolutely. I tell people, I'm like, I think South Carolina is one of the best, the best places to live, just in terms of, we have the beach, we have the mountains, we have, the rivers, we have we have a wonderful Southern hospitality community. We could be number 1 on every great ranking and number 50 on every bad ranking. But we've got to make policy that is best, is what is in, again, I go back to, policy over, or people over party. You've got to make policy decisions that are forward thinking, that are taking into account all of the demographics of South Carolina, and be willing to be innovative. And I don't feel we've had leadership that has demonstrated that in, however long. But I just, I feel like there's such great opportunity here. There's such great promise for the state of South Carolina, but we've got to do better in terms of how we govern.
Yeah, no, totally agree. Well, let's get you elected. Let's get you elected. Because I ultimately think that you in office as superintendent of education, I think that this would push us in the right direction, as far as, because right now you have to, and I've said this before, but South Carolina's only resource that, besides tourism, I guess, is people, is the students, and in order to get, regardless of what you think of the school your kid is going to, in order to give that child the best outlook as possible, all students need to be included. And I feel like, based on everything we've talked about, that your approach is going to be that every student is equal, every student is important. So we got to get you elected. All right. So this is,
well, thank you.
This is where I do the push. The website is lisa4sc.com. You can go out there, you check out Lisa's platform. You can also find links to be able to donate. And regardless of whether you live in South Carolina or not, I know we've got listeners across the country. Check it out. You can make donations, because those donations go to paying for more signs to be distributed, for bumper stickers and postcards and things like mailers. All of the important things that you look at in your mail and you get annoyed at, but they're important. And
they're expensive. I never realized how expensive all that stuff was.
Yeah. No, that's I have considered running for state house, but I don't know. I haven't talked myself into it yet. A couple years. Had I known the guy that was running, had I known the guy that represents my district now, basically the only reason he's run is because he has his own political group, like campaign management group. So that's neither he and I don't get along. He stopped by the house a couple times, so that's all I'll say. But you can check Lisa's website, again, lisa4sc.com. Links to all the information, platform, also upcoming events and things like that. Lisa, it was a pleasure. I am really glad that we could make the time and have you on the podcast this week, because I think that it's important to make sure to get your message out there. So
Well, thank you so much. I enjoyed the conversation so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully at some point here in the near future, maybe if, not before the election, I guess, because things are definitely not going to calm down. But we'd love to get you in the studio so that you can cut up with Zach and Trent as well. So
absolutely, I would love that.
They're a good time. The keg stands are outstanding. No, I'm kidding. Thank you, Nick the Geek, engineer and producer, owner and operator of GOT Sound Studio. Check out details on how you can utilize his talent and production expertise at gotsoundstudio.com. Thanks to Muff the Producer. Follow him on Instagram at Muff the Producer. Thanks to Shiana Rivers for the intro and outro. Follow her podcast, Who You Callin' Holistic, available on most of your podcast listening platforms. Thanks to Trent Clark, aka DJ Lonzo, currently serving as the house DJ at the Main Course in Columbia, South Carolina. Make sure to go by and have a good time. You can contact Trent for all your entertainment needs. Trent at theallaboutnothing.com and on Instagram at TheRealDJLonzo. On Twitter at DJ Lonzo Top 5. You can also phone him 803-262-7982. If you enjoy the show, consider becoming a patron by visiting our website and clicking at the link at the top of the browser that will take you to our Patreon page. You can find details on how you become a supporter, or you can check out benefits there and just consider a donation so that we can continue to bring you this nonsense. We enjoy doing it. We enjoy you enjoying it. As always, you can follow us on Facebook. Just search for All About Nothing US, on Twitter and Instagram at AAN_pod, or you can find links to all of our social media and available podcast platforms by visiting theallaboutnothing.com. If you'd like to be heard on the show, you may call and leave us a message, 803-672-0533. If the time between these episodes is too far apart, you can fill that time by checking out some of our partner podcasts. Zach and I host What the Pod Was That with Carrie Simmons. Visit whatthepodwasthat.com for links and details. Carrie and Chrissy host Status Macabre. You can find details at statusmacabre.com. Ami Bland takes a deep dive down the rabbit hole in episodes of Welcome to Wonderland, available on all of your podcast listening platforms. As well, you should check out our own DJ Lonzo's Top 5, hosted by Trent Clark, available on most of your podcast listening platforms. Lisa, Ellis, thank you very much again for being on the show. If there's ever anything that we can do for you, then please, just have your campaign contact us. Does that seem weird? Does that seem weird saying I'll have the campaign? Yeah.
It does. It does.
All right, Lisa, thank you very much for being on the show, and we will check in with you again, I hope, very soon, and we continue to, we'll hope for success in your campaign and look for your election come November.
Fantastic. Thank you. Take care.
You too.
This The All About Nothing podcast is recorded live from the Maddie Johnson podcast studio at GOT Sound Studio in Columbia, South Carolina. The All About Nothing podcast is produced and engineered by Nick the Geek, owner and operator of GOT Sound Studio. To support the show, please visit theallaboutnothing.com for links to social media, merchandise, and more. Become a patron of the show by following the Patreon link at the top of our page. The All About Nothing podcast is an entertainment product of Barrett Gruber. Special thanks to Zach King, Trent Clark, Muff the Producer, Nick the Geek, and you, our listeners. Please subscribe, rate, review, and share. If you're on YouTube, please hit the like button and the notification bell. Thank you for listening.